Well, hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. And please do hit the like button and subscribe if you like this kind of programming. I know all the musicians, or most of them on this channel, are not all household names. And maybe back in their day, many of these artists were unheralded and didn't get their proper due. But a lot of them are still playing and recording to this day. And I hope through doing these interviews to connect with some old fans of the musicians, and to make some new ones. So please do subscribe if you like this kind of programming. Andy Roberts is an English musician, guitarist, and singer-songwriter. In 1965, while at university, he joined the band The Scaffold playing guitar. The unit would morph into the Liverpool Scene and play many live shows and record 4 albums between 1968 and 1970. In 1972, Andy would form the folk rock band Plainsong with ex-Fairport Convention and Matthews Southern Comfort singer Iain Matthews. Although only one album was released at the time, in years since there have been several archive recordings of Plainsong material and a reformation in recent years, which has led to several new albums released beginning in the 1990s and up to the new millennium. Andy has also had a nice solo career, releasing 4 studio albums, along with a few best of compilations and re-releases of original albums on CD. He also played in the band Grimm's with Vivian Stanshall of the Bonzo Dog Band, with Roy Harper and Kevin Ayers, and on sessions for Cat Stevens and Richard Thompson. And Plainsong is still active to this date. Well, welcome, Andy.
Hi, Greg.
Thanks for joining me today. Take us back to the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in 1946 in London, well, just northwest of London.
Okay. You have some fond childhood memories about maybe perhaps hearing music in the household when you were young?
Not a lot of that. Well, yeah, to some extent. Um, I was very much a child of my time. The only defining thing really being that I had a private education, which meant I went away to school. I went to boarding schools from the age of say 7 to the age of 18. I was away from home much more than I was at home. Um, so the impact of the area that I lived in might have been more had I lived there more of the time. But there was a lot going on. Elton John's from just next village over from where I was born. And there was in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of rock and roll. Screaming Lord Sutch came from Harrow, which was the area where I lived. And
Oh, yeah.
um,
Oh, yeah.
I played with a band called the Blackjacks, local band around there, playing just, scout huts and village institutes and all that stuff. At that time, that area of London was quite countrified. I mean, now it's a giant car park stuck on the side, a car bundle on the side of the
Yeah.
metropolis. I was going
We,
to
we,
say metropolis, but I didn't. I held
Metropolis.
back. Yeah,
We have a few of those here
yeah,
too.
yeah.
Yeah, we have.
Anyway, there was all that going on locally. But when I say I was a child of my time, it was just basically it was American culture.
Okay.
But we had a wonderful, we had terrific radio in this country, and I was very much a fan of that as well.
Yeah.
There was not a lot of music. I mean, I was the first person to buy a record player in my house. My parents didn't particularly do that. My mother was very keen on music. She took me to, when I was very young, sort of 8, 9, she would take me to promenade concerts in London. So that's a classical music series that happens every year and still does. That was started a long, long time back. I mean, more than 100 years ago. And it's a season of international orchestras coming in, playing the same venue, which is the Royal Albert Hall in central London. But my mum used to take me to promenade concerts, and I got a real taste for classical music, and I loved orchestral, the sound that an orchestra made, and I nagged mightily. I'd worked out that the people doing the most with the fiddle, so I nagged said I want to learn violin. So at the age of 9, I started having violin lessons at school, and that started the ball rolling. But I just was very musical, and I loved singing along to variety shows on the radio and all that sort of thing. And I like humor, and I liked variety. Yeah. But then the I got to be quite good at the violin, and ended up later on playing with orchestras and stuff. But I got a scholarship to a private school, music scholarship, and that had a lot to do with what I suppose you'd call a musical development. Because when I got to this school, there was this, I remember one Saturday afternoon hearing this noise coming from the classroom block and going down there to see what was going on and opening a door. And there were these lads with big quiffs and homemade guitars that are made in the school workshop. And they were called Flash, Sid Fanshawe and the Icebergs. And I just was smitten instantly. Just the noise, the sound of valve radios and all these incredible, I mean, obviously terrible instruments, but being played with, real rock and roll commitment. It was brilliant. And in fact, one of the guys in the Icebergs went on, his name was Rick Brown when he was at school, but he worked under the name Ricky Fenson, became a bass player, and he had a good career. Don't know whether he's around now. He'd be pretty ancient now, but because he was older than me. But he was part of the British blues boom. He played with a man who you may not be aware of called Cyril Davies. There's
yes, I am.
Harmonica player. He played with Alexis Corner, and it was around in that the early '60s blues boom, and so I was in the presence of kind of rock royalty, really.
Wasn't Cyril Davies in the All Stars, right? It was that.
Yeah,
okay.
Cyril Davies and the All Stars, yeah.
Right.
Who was somebody that I heard. I don't remember Rick playing bass with him when I heard him, and he died very young. Cyril Davies. I think he got, might have been leukemia or something, but he was gone in his 30s. But he was a very fine harmonica player, and his record Country Line Special was something that it was a bit of a speciality of one of my early bands. When I was at school, I remember we had a great.
At what age did you pick up the guitar?
Well, I started playing guitar when I got my guitar when I was 13. Before that, I had a plastic ukulele, and I used to do kind of skiffle tunes and Lonnie Donegan and all that stuff. But I was beginning to get a taste for American blues. There was a teacher at the first school I went to, which was a boarding school, who collected shellac record, 78 records, and he had a big collection of blues. So he was playing me Lemon Jefferson and Lead Belly and Blind Willie Johnson, but original records that he collected. And he had a guitar. I mean, it was just a Spanish gut string Spanish guitar, but it was signed by Josh White, which I thought was pretty cool. And so I was exposed to that stuff very early on. But really, the first things that I played were, the sort of skiffle, what we call skiffle over here. But of course, that's a good start. That's a bit of folk, a bit of rock. It sort of blues, bluegrass. It sort of covers a lot of genres, really. I got my first guitar when I was 13 for my 13th birthday, and was just wedded to it. I played it for 2 years, just playing the top 4 strings, because that was the same as playing a ukulele, because I could only get around 4 strings. In fact, I'd had it for nearly 2 years before I looked inside and discovered it was stuffed with German newspaper.
Is that right?
It was a German guitar, and it had obviously been, when they packaged it to import it in a cardboard box to the shop it was bought from, stuffed with newspaper. So what's all that? So found there was all this stuff shoved in it, but it took me 2 years to get that out. But,
that's fine.
And by then, I mean, I was also, I mean, by the time I got the guitar, I was also aware of I don't know, Bill Haley, Elvis, Johnny Ray was a big favorite, and just early rockabilly stuff. My brother had a friend who had got all that stuff on record, and so I was listening to that as well. So it's a pretty standard kind of 50s, 60s upbringing, hearing all of those things. And I got an electric guitar in, I guess, probably 61, 62, secondhand, Hofner German, nothing very clever, with a horrible little amplifier, and I was away. And I played, we all wanted to be the Shadows early on, so I played sort of instrumental tunes for a year. And then the blues thing really kicked in, with, as it did for everybody, with Bo Diddley and Chuck Berry, Jimmy Reed, all those players, and then that led us to all the Chicago players, Wolf and Muddy Waters and all that. So I was very fired up by that by 1963. I didn't start playing acoustic guitar until 1965, which was when, I mean, the first guitar I got was an acoustic guitar, but it was a classical, gut strung thing. And once I got an electric guitar, that's what I played. But in 1965, that was the big leap, because I left London and I went to Liverpool to go to university.
Okay.
And that came on the back of a year out from school. I left school in 1964, and I spent a year listening to a lot of music, live music, going to clubs around London, mostly blues clubs, some kind of mod music clubs. But I was then exposed to a whole raft of players in that year, from 64, July 64 through to September 65, when I went to university. That in that year, I heard, John Mayall, I heard the Yardbirds, I heard Clapton play. I found Jeff Beck, who was then playing with a band called the Tridents, who they used to play interval slots at a club I loved called Eel Pie Island.
Right.
And he was great, Jeff, because although he was quite taciturn, he didn't speak on stage, and he played with his back to the crowd most of the time. But if you hung round while he was packing up at the end of the gig, he could be persuaded into letting jewels drip from the hallowed presence. And that was when I found out about I guess what we call Nashville tuning. Well, no, that's high stringing. It just putting light strings on a guitar so you could bend the strings. But of course, they didn't sell light strings in those days. They only sell, big dance band heavy strings.
Right.
But Jeff, I said to Jeff, how do you? You do this thing, you can kind of push the strings around and you get all these great sounds bending the strings. And he said, well, he said, what you do is you get your Gibson Sonomatic set. He said, and then you get the bottom string, and he said, you cut that, there's a little round thing on the bottom. He said, you cut that off with a pair of pliers and throw the string away. Then you put the strings on your guitar, like the fifth string that you put on the A string, they put on as your bottom string, that becomes your E string. And so they're all one string down, as it were. And then he said, for a top string, what you do is, he said, you go to Clifford Essex. That was a guitar shop in London. And he said, you go to Clifford Essex and you get a black diamond tenor banjo first string. And he said that comes, but it's got a loop on the end. It hasn't got one of those little round things. But he said he put the little round thing in the loop and you twist it so that it's in it. And he used that as the top string. And that's what I do. That's what my strings are.
Banjo string.
tenor banjo, first string. Yeah. So that was how I got into, what nowadays would be a conventional modern electric guitar string set, but you couldn't get those in those days. So that turned things around, because I was already playing blues music, but I was playing it with heavy strings, so we all sounded like, T-Bone Walker, but we didn't sound like Jeff Beck, you know what I mean?
Right. What about Peter Green?
Peter Green, I heard Peter Green play with Mayall. And then later on, by 1968, I was touring with Liverpool Scene by then, and Fleetwood Mac were on the same circuit, so we were always coming across them. But that was the original Fleetwood Mac,
Right.
not
No,
the Buckingham Nicks Fleetwood Mac. This
no.
was,
The original, yeah. I love
but
the
of
original.
course,
Yeah.
but you got Mick Fleetwood, John McVie, and
Sure.
Greenie, and Jeremy Spencer and Danny Kirwan,
Danny
and
Kirk.
just all that
Yeah.
wonderful writing that Peter was doing.
Oh,
So
I
I was
prefer
around for all of that.
I prefer the early stuff. Yeah, myself.
Well,
Yeah.
you're not comparing like with like. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
different thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so from 65 onwards, I was based in Liverpool, but I was a student. So I was, going to lectures, and I was doing a law course. I was headed to be a lawyer.
Right.
And I didn't graduate till 1968, but by then I'd done things. I mean, I never kept diaries, Greg. I never, and of course there were no mobile phones, so
Yeah.
there was no chance to get a selfie. So I wish I'd got,
Yeah.
records of other than sound recordings of some of the stuff I did during
Right.
those 3 years, because I
Right.
played with ridiculously good people,
Right.
I mean, I fell early on. I fell under because when I went to Liverpool, I bought a steel strung acoustic guitar, thinking, well, I'm going to Liverpool. Everybody in Liverpool's in a band, and I'll never get in a band because I'm not from Liverpool, and all of that. So I need to be self-contained. So that's what I did. I became a blues singer, or I mean, just somebody that could play on his own.
Yeah.
So I went to the university folk club and did stuff, but then I fell in with the Scaffold. I'd met them just before I went to up to Liverpool, and in fact, the decision to go to Liverpool to university as opposed to other universities that were also offering me placements was because I'd met the Scaffold.
Okay.
I met them when I was doing a theatre gig in July, August 65 at the Edinburgh Festival. I'd been to the Edinburgh Festival the previous 2 years as an orchestral player. I've been a violinist playing with an orchestra. But this was I got a job as a guitarist playing for a late night review show in a theatre club, very small theatre, 51 seats. It was called the Traverse. And it was newly opened, and it had just an extraordinary roster of individuals going through it. There was a mime artist called Lindsay Kemp, and in the company for his show, there was this strange, very pasty-faced, ginger-haired chap, quite tall, called Vivian Stanshall, and he was part of Lindsay Kemp's show.
Yeah.
There were plenty of extremely good actors that were going through that had shows on at various times. I was in this late night review that was from Trinity College Dublin, and a lot of the people from that went on to have good careers as actors. And then this group from Liverpool, 3 people, the Scaffold came in to occupy the same time slot that we just vacated, the Trinity College team.
Yeah.
So that's when I met them and got to know them. And
early on,
yeah,
before they became actual group, you played guitar to back them, and it was more like poetry readings, right?
Well, one of them is a poet and remains a poet. And in fact, I was talking to him yesterday. We're playing together at the end of Roger will be 87 in a couple of weeks. Yeah. And we're playing together in London. We're playing the O2 big venue at the end of November. But the other 2, one of them was Mike McCartney, who was Paul's brother.
Right.
And another one's a chap called John Gorman, who's a very funny comedian. Who's even older. Gorman's 89 now, I think. Yeah. So Mike's only just about 18 months older than me. But they were, but the thing is, they were from Liverpool. They might as well have been from from outer space. I mean, it's an impenetrable accent. I'd not been exposed to it really. I'd heard a little bit of the sort of wacky mop top stuff with the Beatles in
Right.
63, 64, but I hadn't really been exposed to any of that.
Right.
So yeah, that was interesting. But Roger, I got on with. He'd been a teacher. He hadn't a sort of an academic brain, I suppose, and I'd been educated to a high degree by then, and also I was looking to go to university. He'd been to university, and I love poetry. I'd seen poetry and jazz in Cambridge when I was at school. I'd gone to Cambridge to see poetry played with jazz, or play jazz, and I'm afraid it was jazz 1, poetry 0, as far as I was concerned, because it just didn't work. There was no concession. People weren't actually accompanying the poetry. The jazzers were just doing what they did, and the poets were desperately trying to keep up. It was not an effective combination, really. Although, I mean, yeah, but it did have cash out. I mean, people. A man called Jeremy Robson was the principal poet of doing this sort of poetry and jazz collaborations. But Laurie Lee, Danny Absey, Thomas Blackburn, there were a lot of good poets were involved with it, and the jazzers were no slouches. Shake Keane on flugelhorn, Joe Harriott, a wonderful West Indian alto sax player, and the Michael Garrick Trio were around on the jazz circuit. I mean, it was all good ingredients. It just didn't quite work as to the benefit of the poetry. And I thought this through with Roger and said, I've got ideas about what would work with poetry. And anyway, I got to Liverpool. I met Roger again very early, and that was just happenstance, really, because there were nobody swapped numbers. Nobody had phones in those days.
Yeah.
So it was just fortuitous that I bumped into him in the centre of Liverpool, and
it was
I got involved
right?
with
it was in a bookstore.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, the first day I was in Liverpool, and so I became involved in the social circle around the art college. And then Roger said, well, we talked about doing something. So he said, I've got this poetry read. This was sort of the end of the year, I suppose, the end of 65. And so I've got a poetry reading scheduled for, I think it was February 66 at a theatre called the Sandon Theatre, which is part of a very old complex in Liverpool called the Bluecoat Chambers. And he said, why don't we do something, try and do something together? So I started going around, took the guitar around, and we sat down, and I just started playing along while he read his poetry. And it worked for us. So I was quite an integrated part of that show, and it went down really well. I mean, people really responded to it. So thereafter, quite soon after that, I became the accompanist for the Scaffold, because they never had music in the show. If there was music at all, it was just them singing a cappella. Right. And then none of them instrumentalists, although Mike is very musical. Mike's extremely good at writing tunes and good singer and that. But so I just became a sort of an addendum to the Scaffold, which was just the 3 people and would remain so. But I was their accompanist or music director, whatever. And I played incidental music, and I accompanied songs, all that sort of thing.
Right.
And
well,
that
I was going to say Mike going by Mike McGear, he did put out a couple of good albums there in the early 70s.
The first one, I played on the first one particularly, and which is called Woman. And it's a remarkable piece of work. It's a very extraordinary record.
Yes, it is.
It's not like anything else. It's nothing like what his brother was doing. It's nothing like anybody was doing, really. It's uniquely his own thing. And quite rightly, Melody Maker made it their album of the month. And when it was released, I think, in 1970. And it had a big bonus for me, because that was where I really got to know and play with Zoot Money, who has just died. But Zoot, George Bruno Money, became a fantastic friend and collaborator through all eras of my career. Really a terrific man. And as I say, he just died. But that was a joy to come out of it. So yeah, but that was after the Scaffold. I played with the Scaffold until 1968, when they had their biggest hit record, which was called Lily the Pink, which is a very, very sort of novelty record, really.
Right, novelty. They did have, I was going to mention, they did have a few, humorous songs. There was that side of the band, but then there were some other sides, some decent, serious pop, like I can't make you mine. That's one of my favorites. You remember that?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a very it was an interesting act, and I just talked to somebody. As I say, there's a box set coming out.
Right.
They're compiling it now, and the guy phoned me, and I had a Zoom call with him, and that lasted a couple of hours just on the Scaffold, because the range of what they did was so extraordinary. They worked in theatre. They were a sketch act. They had really serious poetry. They had a big musical dimension and a massive amount of humor shot through. And it was a really interesting act, but you couldn't tie it down. You couldn't, and that's also to its detriment. You couldn't say it was one thing.
You couldn't label.
If it had only been a music act, then they could have been, I don't know, more. The record company could have made them into Right Said Fred or something, and made them a sort of, sort of focus them as a novelty music thing. But that wasn't all that they did by any means.
Right. That's unfortunate. Yeah. If you can't pigeonhole or label an artist, then it's, right.
That's it. So it's very difficult, because if journalists can't put a label on it, they won't write about it.
That's right.
And I think, they are truly remarkable, and the legacy is still quite disparate, because they tried all sorts of things. I mean, EMI Records, Parlophone they were signed to. They did the first two records of theirs I played on were albums, and they were live shows. They were spoken word shows in front of an audience.
Right.
I mean, there was a little bit of a history of that sort of thing selling, in that there'd been theatre shows that had that kind of quality that had done quite well beyond the Fringe, which was with Peter Cook and Dudley Moore and Jonathan Miller. That had been pretty successful on record. And another act which probably didn't get to the States, that was known, they put out a record called At the Drop of a Hat. The two, it was just a two-man show, Flanders and Swan. Donald Swan and Michael Flanders. Michael Flanders was in a wheelchair. He'd had polio. Swan was a pianist and a really a serious musical composer, and they wrote novelty songs, and they were brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So I was taken to see them by my parents as a youngster. I mean, at the Fortune Theatre in London, I went to see At the Drop of a Hat. So that's part of the sort of British tradition of that sort of coming out of vaudeville, music hall, that sort of thing. Obviously, beyond the Fringe, they were a bit more modern, because they were political in a way that the more music hall things weren't. But there was always review stuff going on, a lot of good people coming out of it. And the Scaffold probably sort of fitted into that, really. I might have been influenced, in fact, from that tradition. But they were remarkable, and they remain great friends. They're all still with us, and, long may they continue. But I stopped doing that when I was doing my university finals, and they had hit a streak where they were so successful. So they were wanting me to do, weeks in variety clubs and stuff. And I couldn't do that because I got work to do at university and a degree to achieve. So that's what I did. But by then I was working much more with Adrian Henry. I lived in the same house as him. And there was a group of musicians and writers that had coalesced around sort of the art college, and particularly around Adrian. It was known as the Liverpool Scene, but that was just the name of a book. in
Right.
fact.
That was a poetry collection, right?
Yeah, there's a poetry
Yeah.
collection called Liverpool Scene.
Okay.
And on the back of that, we did one album in '67. That was the first album I ever played on, which is actually called The Incredible New Liverpool Scene, but it's not the Liverpool Scene band. It was just Adrian, myself, and Roger McGough, who is the poet from the Scaffold. It was just the three of us.
Okay.
And that came out on CBS over here and Epic in the US. Don't think it's sold anything, but it does exist. And that started a ball rolling in terms of national recognition, really, because a British disc jockey called John Peel got hold of it.
Oh, yes. Very
And
familiar.
in those days, John was on one of the pirate radio ships off the east coast of England, Radio London, and he would do a sort of stoner show at midnight every night called the Perfume Garden. And it would broadcast to the southeast of England. You couldn't hear it in Liverpool, but you'd hear it in London. So I would hear it when I came back from university to my parents' place in vacations. And there'd be John on air for at least 2 hours. But frankly, he'd be on for as long as he wanted to be on because there was no curfew. He was the last program of the day. And then it would, after him, it would close down and then it would start up again at 7 a.m. So he could do what the hell he wanted. And he got hold of that record. And when he liked something, I mean, it's what I was from John. I was hearing Country Joe and the Mothers and the Dead, and all of the San Francisco bands, the Airplane. And he wouldn't just play a track; he'd play one side. I mean, he'd literally put a record on and play 6 tracks consecutive and stuff like that. And in between, he would read poetry or quote stuff and talk about stuff that interested him, and he was a classic hippie. And as I say, it was just a stoner show, and he was building a very big following in London. So when I was back from university one time, it's probably 67, I think, because that was all building. We had a publication again in London called International Times, which is a very much a hippie sort of flower child thing, and was openly talking about dope and music and much else besides. And so there was a whole culture that was coalescing around that, and there were shows, music events, and poetry events, whatever, happening across London, and John Peel was involved with some of those. So I went to one because he was billed as probably in IT as being, Implosion this week will feature John Peel as a disc jockey. So I thought, I got to meet this guy. He's just played a side of my record. So I shuffled on. I was all very shy in those days, so I just shuffled along and introduced myself, and he said, "Oh, great, yeah, it's great. So we got chatting, and he said, "Well, what are you doing? Well, come by the house on Friday, and we'll do something." And so, well, it wasn't a house; it was a flat. So I ended up being, very friendly with him and his then wife, and spending time with them and going around doing stuff. And he championed what we were
Championed a
doing
lot of bands. Yeah.
Well,
Yes,
in Liverpool, he came up to Liverpool, and because he was from Liverpool, and so he came up, and he literally slept on the floor. I mean, he came up and stayed on my couch, whatever. Just hung around town and just got into the scene that was going in Liverpool. That was the post Beatles thing, which included the Liverpool scene and the Scaffold and
interesting.
a lot of singer-songwriters.
John's history interesting. He's got his start over here in Oklahoma City at a radio station, and of course, they welcomed him. At that time, because of the Beatles, anybody with a Liverpudlian accent was you can have a job. It was just like.
Well, Shirley, his first wife, was American, and when I met him, he'd only just come back from America. I mean, he'd been back, 3-4 months. But he got a job from the Pirates, and I say Perfume Garden, his show, really very rapidly achieved a good following. So,
Right. Well,
but it was
going
good,
back to
exciting time. I mean, you're talking about months, so it didn't take long for this thing to build into, you know. I met John, and probably within 9 months,
yeah,
I graduated from university. I was a full-time player, and we
that's
were
right.
off touring, and John was promoting us on tour. He was being, we were going around colleges and.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Playing live in '69, you played on Zeppelin's first UK tour.
Yeah,
Any
yeah.
recollections? Were they tight? Were they tight?
Many recollections of the tour. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, there's. There are a lot of anomalous things happen. I remember playing in Bristol. The hall was barely half full.
Wow.
That didn't happen for a Zeppelin show ever again, probably.
Never again.
But
Never.
yeah, because nobody knew who they were, really. I mean, they were having to explain the sort of evolution from the Yardbirds to Zeppelin, and how Jim had kind of gone over and how he'd found Bonzo and Percy in Birmingham, and it's all sort of recommendation and stuff. Yeah, it was just it was interesting times, and they were big. They were the headline acts, and we were on the bill with another British band called Blodwyn Pig, which was the band started by Mick Abrahams, who'd been the original guitarist. He'd done one album with Jethro Tull.
Jethro Tull, yeah.
And then been one of the earliest people to decide they couldn't work with Ian Anderson. Mick Abrahams. There've been a few since.
Not the last, but
I think Martin's touring the States right now. I keep seeing clips on YouTube of Martin doing, and Martin's lovely. I mean, he's a great player, and he's stuck it out for a long time. But Ian, I never worked with him except he produced the Maddie Pryor solo album that I was all over in the mid-'70s. So I worked with him then, but he was not on my case. He was very, very, he's quite hands-off where I was concerned. But I saw him working over the bass player and drummer, so I knew what he could be like. And he's quite a difficult man to work with, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's to this day, it's a complete mystery to me why Led Zeppelin chose the Liverpool Scene as a support act, how that came about. I mean, I think it was just pushed on them by the agency. They weren't a big enough act to really stand in the way of what Chris Liss as an agency wanted to do. And they put both Blodwyn and our band were big draws on the circuit at that point. In 1969, that was our peak year for Liverpool Scene. And as a live act, we were absolutely pulling them in. The misfortune was that we never had recorded product to kind of justify the billing after that. Had we come up with the right kind of recording and been able to be successful on record as well, we could have gone a lot further. But we were far too arty, I mean,
right. Well,
we did great stuff. We did important stuff, I think. Yeah. But again, it's like Scaffold. It was very disparate. You couldn't really put your finger on what we were, because I was quite folky, and the whole thing lent towards jazz, but it had a very strong rock quality. But then we were fronted by an 18.5 stone poet. So how do you pull those strands together?
Right. How do you label that? You can't.
Yeah, it was very hard. So but it was terrific on the night, because you couldn't take your eyes off it. There was so much going on, and it was funny, and it was touching. It was, it had musical heights, and it was just a great act. But to get all that on record was very difficult.
Yeah. Well, I had a couple other questions on playing live and touring. The Isle of Wight Festival. How was that with Bob Dylan and the band?
Yeah, well, it was it was a fillip to get it, and we knew that was a good thing. It came, we'd played the Bath Festival of the Blues the day before, or certainly a couple of days before, and that was a very big festival date for 1969. But I mean, you look at the poster for the for the Bath Festival in 1969, and it's a one-day festival, and it had 12 headline acts, including Led Zeppelin, John Mayall, Blondman were on there. We were on there. Oh hell, there was just so many. Chicken Shack was on. I mean, just every act was a top drawing act for the circuit at that point, you know. And we all played 40 minutes and went home. And the Isle of Wight was a different thing, because obviously there was a fair amount of fuss made about Dylan and the sheer scale of the event. But the big thing was that they'd managed to get Dylan to agree to do it. Really, I mean, he hadn't played live anywhere for 3 years.
Yeah.
So that was a big deal, and it was a 3-day show. We played on the Sunday, so it started on the Friday, had a full bill on the Friday, full bill on the Saturday, and the Sunday was headlined by Dylan and the band. And all the acts leading up to it were quite kind of gentle, really. Julie Felix, Tom Paxton, Richie Havens.
Yeah,
you know, there were sort of acoustic solos, really.
Yeah, right.
But we played earlier. We played around 1 p.m. Dylan was on about 7 or 8. The band maybe on at 7 and Dylan on at 8. And what really got our legend going was the fact that they'd news in those days. They wouldn't cover stuff like that on television because there was no. I mean, there were no OBs in those days. I mean, it was way before outside broadcast, except for sporting events. There was no news outside broadcasting really. They certainly didn't cover events like that. So they were covered by newsreel, but like Pathé and British Gaumont, who had theatres that were news theatres, and they put together news of the week on film, and they would film big events like that, and they put together a sort of news magazine that lasted for 20 minutes or something, and they would play it on a rolling program in a news reel theatre, and it would be, you get the news, and then you get Bugs Bunny and all that stuff, and then you get a pictorial, a Pathé pictorial about somebody showing you how to make pots, and then you know what I mean, on a sculpture or something, and then there'd be another cartoon, and then the news would start again, and it would be a rolling program. And people would go in for an hour, it cost nothing, it was only pence to go in, and you'd sit there, watch it. And as soon as the thing started again, you'd leave. And they piled down from London because it was a big thing, and they'd heard of this bloke, Bob Dylan. So they thought, we better cover this. There's going to be a lot of kids there, and it's going to be interesting. And it's very invasive as far as the Isle of Wight is concerned. So they came down on the day that Dylan was playing, and the most visual thing by far was an 18.5 stone poet going ape shit on stage with a band behind him. So we got all the newsreel coverage. They talked about Bob Dylan, but they'd all come down from London, and they certainly didn't want to wait till the end and then be in a 6-mile motor queue to get back on the ferry to go back to London. Professional cameramen weren't going to do that. So they came down, filmed us, talked about Bob Dylan, but we were the visuals.
You were the visuals.
So, So, anybody that week that was going to go to a newsreel and see the Isle of Wight Festival talked about, we were the acts that you were going to see. So that kind of built the myth a bit as well. Then we came over pretty soon after that. We came over and toured the States.
The States, I was going to ask you, was that your first time? Was that your first time?
Well, it was the only time at Liverpool Scene. Yeah, first time for me in the States. Terrifying. I didn't leave the hotel for 2 days. I couldn't, it was just, I was scared to death. But it was the same thing, as I said about recording. I mean, we just had no idea how to, our first gig was playing Kent State in Akron, 17,500 kids in a sports stadium, and we were supporting Sly. And I mean, Sly and his Family Stone, they got equipment. There was so much of it. It was in rows across the stage, And we were down the front. We were the opening act, and I had a 30-watt amplifier. and I mean, we just had this tiny little stuff, and it was poems and weird stuff about, Liverpool and ferry boats, and I mean, it's just the audience had got no idea. They were all tripping. You know what I mean? I mean, they hadn't got a clue what was going on. So we just lurched from disaster to disaster all around the East Coast, which is all that we played. And we played with the Who in Chicago. We knew the Who really well, so that was nice. But the audience, it's still 5,000 people tripping. We played with Eric Burden and War in Philly. I remember that. The show I really liked was playing with the Steve Miller Band at the Boston Tea Party.
Right.
I liked that. That was a couple of nights, and I love Steve Miller. I'd already got a record or two of his, and they treated us very well. Right. We got good sound checks, and Steve was appreciative. And the other show that I really enjoyed, of the bigger shows, was playing with the Association. They treated us really well.
Is that right? Okay.
That was an interest. I can't remember where it was now, but that was interesting. But then we played a lot of small club dates and things like that. I mean, in New York, we played a club called Ungano's, which is a jazz club. And the thing I remember mostly about that was that Charles Mingus came to see us, and he was brought by a black beat poet called Ted Jones that we knew. Ted was a friend, and he was great. He took us to Harlem to see Archie Shepp and stuff. We were the only white people in the room. I mean, it was just insane. He was going, Ted was going around saying, "Oh, it's okay. They're cool. They're cool." It was only kids, long hairs from Liverpool, kind of loving it. But, and it was just like, things like that were utterly brilliant. And then, Mingus came to Ungano's, and so did Keith Moon. So we had Mingus and Keith Moon in the same club at the same time.
Did he destroy anything that time?
No, Moon didn't play with us. I knew him, or we knew all the Who, because we'd been, again, the Who didn't break in the States. Yeah. I mean, even by then they hadn't broken in the States, really. Tommy broke them, and that was later on. This was 69. I mean, when was Tommy? But Tommy might have been released in 69, but the Who weren't a big act.
Yeah.
I mean, they were big. They were playing to 5,000 in Chicago, but they weren't a stadium act at that point. Exactly. But Mooney, I knew because he was. I got to know him better later because he was such a big friend with Viv, and I was around Viv for so many years. Viv Stanshall.
Yeah.
So
speaking of Steve Miller, he's still playing. I saw an ad here locally that but I'm sure none of the original backing band. It's probably just him. And
I mean, Boz Scaggs, for starters, was in the band at the Tea Party. So I mean, it's a different thing. No, somebody said that Steve Miller he does a couple of dates a year. I mean, if you want to pay him $250,000, he'll play. But that's it. But I just think he's incredibly good. I mean, he's a really good pop act, great songs. He's a great player. He puts together great bands. I've got some videos from the 80s of Steve Miller bands, various Steve Miller bands, with the one with Norton Buffalo, playing harmonica and stuff.
Yeah, I've always been a fan.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's all good stuff, and it's just a great act. Really good act. Yeah,
it is.
So that was the American tour, but we lost money. We came back absolutely broken, and there was no way back from that, because by then we'd kind of lost momentum in the UK from being away, and also we came back and we recorded our most problematic album in terms of sales, but it was I think the most important legacy of the band. I mean, it was like there were big things that we did, and then there were sort of silly nonsense things that we did, and the nonsense things we tend to be the things we're remembered for. I think the first side of that third Liverpool Scene album, which was called Made in USA, and it's a collage poem. It's funny, the whole side of a record, 25 minutes long or something, and that is a seriously good bit of work. It's important, and it's all in there, you know.
And you guys broke up in 70.
Yeah, we broke up in May 1970, and I had a big decision to make at that point. It was either to stay in Liverpool and not know what the heck I was going to do next, or to leave Liverpool and hole up with my parents and try and re-establish in London. And that's what I decided to do. By then, I had the support of the Liverpool Scene's manager, Sandy Robertson. So he was saying, well, you know, what do you want to do? And I said, well, you know, he said, mate, you should have a band. You should, you know, I'd done one solo record by then. He said, you should get a band around you, and I'll manage it and produce it. And so that became Everyone. But there was a bit of a delay on that, because on my way down from Liverpool in May 1970, I stopped off to see Principal Edward's Magic Theatre, who were living as a commune near Northampton. And they were friends from the circuit. And I stopped, and I got drunk with the lights guy in a pub at lunchtime, and ended up racing motorbikes around the farmyard. And I came off a bike on some gravel and ripped up my left arm. So that kind of put me out of commission for a few months. Yeah, so I couldn't play for a bit. So, and that was when I sort of started corralling people to play in Everyone. David Richards had already been playing bass with me for a few months, and then I found John Porter and Bob Sargent, and the drummer John Pearson I knew, put that band together. But we were only together, and we played the Isle of Wight Festival in 1970. That was our first gig. But a couple of months after that, we had a road crash, and the road manager was killed, and all the equipment was strewn over the A33 and, you know, bits. And I was really very powerfully affected by that. I mean, Paul Scard, who died, was 19 years old. He'd been a roadie for the Liverpool Scene, and he'd stuck with me over that summer when I was laid up because of the motorcycle thing. He used to come round to see me. He was sort of part of the planning, really, for Everyone. And as soon as we were on the road, he was driving for us. And to lose him, you know, after a couple of months, and it was, you know, there was also, I mean, we wrote off a van as well as all the equipment and everything. And obviously, as the nominal leader of the entire thing, I felt very responsible for it. And it took me a while to kind of get over it. And that was the point when, because Mike McCartney had actually been talking to Paul Samuel Smith, who Samo had been in the Yardbirds, been the bass player of the Yardbirds back in the Clapton days. But by then he was a record producer, and he was producing Iain Matthews, who had gone from Southern Comfort, the band, to being a solo act. And Samuel Smith was his producer, designated producer. And he was looking for someone, a guitarist, to work with Iain, because Iain wasn't much of a player in those days. He wanted somebody to kind of fluff up the chords and work with him on songs and everything. And that was the sort of work that I'd done, all those years before the Scaffold, you know, where none of them were instrumentalists particularly. And, I had good musical smarts when it came to that sort of work. So he asked me to go around and meet Iain, so I did. And we just hit it off. We found we'd been born within 4 days of each other. We had very much the same kind of musical, not so much taste, because he knew a lot more about music than I did, really. But we'd grown up through the same era and had been subject to the same influences, ended up kind of pretty different people. But I immediately got drawn into working on the songs for his first solo album. And because of that, I in the early part of 1971, I fell into this pattern where I was living at home with my parents. I was playing sessions for Samuel Smith, which was Iain initially, but I was also spending a lot of time with Viv Stanshall, who lived quite close. He lived in East Finchley then. So I hung a lot with Viv. So I was doing stuff with him. And that's when all the session stuff that came on the back of that, really, getting to know all those electric folk people, the Richard Thompsons and Tim Rennick as guitarists, and Jerry Conway, Pat Donaldson's a rhythm section, Mattox, of course, Sandy, they were all people that I then got to know and started working with, and so 71 was a funny year. It was quite disparate. I was doing I went on tour with the Bonzos, but a band called Bonzo Dog Freaks, which was Viv and Neil, and myself, another guitarist called Bubbles, who was kind of fat boy, great player, David Richards on bass, Ian Wallace on drums, and various African bods, Shamsi Sarumi. They were mates of Viv's because Viv liked African drumming, so there's a lot of that in the act. And so we did that for a time. Keith Moon played with us occasionally, and what else? I can't remember. I was still working with Scaffold and doing odd Scaffold dates through that year, and then I toured the US in July that year with Ian. Ian, by then we made a start on his second solo album. The first one was out, and it was going to be a band with Timmy Donald on drums and David Richards on bass, me and Richard Thompson and Ian. So it was going to be a 5-piece, and then Ian changed his mind and said he wanted to do it as an acoustic 3-piece. So it ended up with being just Ian, me, and Richard. So just the three of us touring for 2.5 months in the States. So that came along. And then as soon as I got back from that, I was off on tour promoting my stuff, because I was recording solo stuff as well all through that year. So it's just working all the time, Then I went on tour to promote the Nina and the Dream Tree album, and I was touring with Steel Eye Span. I was supporting them on tour.
Well, that's I was going to say, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no,
I wanted to talk. I wanted to talk about your solo. Some of you, not all of them, so we don't have time for that. But I have the two CD.
Time for any of this.
the two CD anthology, just for the record. I have that. I wanted to mention some of my favorites. Maybe get your backstory, inspiration behind the song, if you could. I think from the first album, your first Queen of the Moonlight World, that's my favorite on there. Nice use of the Mellotron. That's one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's Ian Whiteman from Mighty Baby, who ended up in various Richard Thompson bands in the 70s because he became a Sufi Muslim along with Richard and Linda. But Mighty Baby, they'd been the Action originally, and then they became Mighty Baby. Queen of the Moonlight World, funnily enough, that hails right back to the night that Bob Dylan played the Isle of Wight Festival.
Is that right?
Yeah, because our gig was over, so I spent the afternoon, drinking and the rest, and I was in the pressing clothes. I was only about 50 foot from the stage for the band and Dylan, and I fell in with a girl called Casey. It was a singer. She was with a group called Thunder Thighs, a vocal group, all-girl vocal group called Thunder Thighs, and I set up a date with her, and that date was at London Zoo. And there was a new attraction at the zoo that had been built. It was called the Charles Claw House for Small Mammals. Charles Claw was a British property magnate. He was a guy that built fancy buildings. But it was also known as the Moonlight World because all of these animals were nocturnal, and they did the thing of reversing the light state in this new attraction, so that when you went in the day, it was darkened down and all the nocturnal animals were active, and then at night they put the lights on and they'd all go to sleep. So it was a chance to see all those things. When you go to the zoo and it says, here's what's in here, and you look and it says Kinkajou, and you think, what's that? Well, you can't bloody see it, because it's in a ball of straw at the back. You know what I mean? So they had this thing, and also, of course, if you were going to go on a date, what's better than to be in a room full of little furry creatures snuffling
Yeah.
about and no light?
Right.
It was so. Queen of the Moonlight Well, it just wrote itself.
Yeah.
That was it. Only date, nothing happened. But it was. That's what the song is. It's about being with Casey in the Charles Claw House for small mammals, which possibly isn't there anymore. I don't know, but that's what that track's about.
That's what that's about. That's why I
Yeah,
like to hear origins of songs like yours.
yeah,
Well,
absolutely. Yeah.
moving on to 71's Nina and the Dream Tree. You just mentioned that.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
keep
that's
my
almost all of that record is on that collection, the Just for the Record collection. Apart
Okay.
from one track, actually, there's one Spider John Kerner song I didn't put on.
Oh, okay. Keep My Children Warm. That's a beautiful track.
Yeah, I just did that. I did it as an encore on my solo show I played here in
Oh, you
town
did.
in Brighton. Yeah,
Yeah.
about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
In fact, yeah, yeah.
Did
Um,
did it go down
and
well? Did the fans
it
remember it?
was a really, really special
Yeah.
moment. It was the last number. We did it as an encore, and I did it with my two children on stage with me. So Millie and Will had played the show with me. Will is the most remarkable musician. He sings, he plays brass, he plays his principal instrument is trombone, but he plays, yeah, he started on euphonium and then went over to trombone, but he now plays all brass, plays as much trumpet as he plays anything else now. He's a jazzer. He teaches, he arranges, he conducts, he does stuff, he sings, he does chorus stuff. His YouTube channel is well worth a visit and is quite extraordinary. So
Go ahead and plug that. Go ahead and plug his channel.
Well, it's called Will Roberts Music.
Okay. Okay.
And there's a lot of stuff. When he was at the Royal College of Music, he graduated with a first class Bachelor of Music degree. When COVID came, they sent him home, and he did all of his. For 2 years, he was doing his lectures and master classes and stuff online. So he was working from home. So he started recording trombone pieces, multiple, doing split screen sort of trombone quartets and stuff like that, arranging and recording those. But then he did some choral stuff. Then he started doing a bit of jazz, did some Jacob Collier stuff and all of that. And then he latterly, the last couple of years, he's done 3 things with his sister Millie singing. And Millie trained. She went to this school called the Brit School, first of all, which when she was 16, which is the school where Adele and Jessie J and a lot of those people came from. It's and that kid that plays Spider-Man, what's his name? Tom Holland. He went there. Yeah, he went to Brit School at the same time as Millie. It's just a performing arts school. So she went there for 2 years, and then she went to LAMDA, the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art. She graduated from there. She's an actress, and she works a lot in theatre administration and that sort of thing, because she's got a good brain for that stuff as well. And she sings beautifully, but she's not interested in singing. She's never wanted to be a singer, but she sings beautifully. So she was on the show with me as well. And I just say that there are 3 songs on Will Roberts Music that she sings that are quite remarkable. One of which we did on the show is Jackson Browne's For a Dancer. We did a beautiful song, and we did that on my solo show 2 weeks ago. But I finished the whole night. The audience wanted another one. And I thought, we'll do Keep My Children Warm, because it's not hard to get hold of melodically. I mean, harmonically, it's a pretty simple song. And it's got that sung refrain, Keep My Children Warm,
that's what
at
I like.
the end. So we did that. And and it went down. I mean, it was the perfect encore because it ended with one of those moments of perfect peace, the utter silence. You could hear a pin drop, and then the audience goes nuts, because it was really beautiful.
Right.
And I think the sort of the poetry of the moment with here's this, I'm the act, but here I am with my children, and
Yeah.
I'm singing "Keep My Children Warm," and they're singing "Keep My Children Warm" behind me, and
There you
it had
go.
it had a sort of perfect synchronicity about it. So
Yeah, apropos. Well,
yeah,
the other track off of Nina and the Dream Tree that I enjoy is I've seen the movie. Nice addition
yeah.
of the strings. I like the strings in that.
Well, a string arrangement on that track is by Robert Kirby, who is unfortunately died a long time ago now. He had a heart problem and he died on an operating table. Very dear friend and colleague. He was the arranger for all of the strings on the Nick Drake albums that everybody remembers, and
Yeah.
he was at Cambridge with Nick, and I did loads with Robert. I mean, he was in the pit band for my first musical, which was in early 1974. We did a theatre again in 78 when I did a theatre version of Summer with Monica, which was a poetry and music collaboration that I'd done with Roger McGough from the Scaffold, but the original collaboration was done in 1968. Then we recorded an orchestral version of it with arrangements, some by Robert, some by John Megginson, who was another Liverpool musician from Liverpool that had worked with Scaffold, and again was around the sort of art college area, but he was a very smart arranger, conductor, and we put out this album called Summer with Monica. And then we did a theatre version of it, which Robert played in the band for that. And he was just a lovely, lovely man, very important to me. The arrangement, I've seen the movie, is absolutely exquisite. But the song is about when we had that devastating crash with everyone, the band. I retreated for a month. I rented a house in Northamptonshire, close to where Principal Edwards were, because they were friends. And I thought, well, if I need to go somewhere and be with people that I know and who won't hassle me, that'd be the place. Because I was basically trying to get my head around the fact that Paul had been killed in the crash and all that. And I went to this house with David Richards. So there's two of us went. So we were writing and playing all day, all the time, really. And we just, and was in the same position as me. I mean, he'd been in the same band, and we were both trying to, make sense of this situation. I had a girlfriend at the time that she was older than me. Her name was Polly James. She was quite well known in this country. She'd been in a television series called The Liver Birds. I met her through working with the Scaffold. She'd been in a Scaffold show, playing sketch material with them. She was not from Liverpool, but she was from southwest Lancashire, so similar area. Lovely, lovely girl, really, really nice person. And we'd had some good adventures together. And in fact, that year, 1970, I spent New Year's Eve 1970 in Tommy Steele's house. You probably don't know who Tommy Steele is.
I know Tommy Steele.
He was an early English rock and roll, probably the first ever rock and roll star in England. Right. He was never rock and roll. He was a musical artist, really. I mean, he was a music theatre guy. But he'd made plenty of money, and he'd been in a musical show called Half a Sixpence. He was in the film as well, but he'd been on Broadway in Half a Sixpence. And Polly, who was a great singer, was in that show with him, along with Tony Perkins, who was Norman Bates from Psycho. Yeah. So that's another thing I did with Polly, was I went to have tea with Tony Perkins at the Savoy Hotel in London. And I sat in this ridiculously swanky hotel with my mouth firmly clamped, sitting there thinking, bloody hell, it's Norman Bates, bloody hell, it's Norman Bates for 2 hours, while Polly and Tony just kind of caught up and rabbited and all the rest of it. And I'm sitting there looking at the guy from Psycho. I mean, it was just, you couldn't make it up, Greg. It was, I've had the most ridiculous life. Anyway, that's Polly is who that song is about. And because she was an actress, it was, I don't know, we were never close. We had a great relationship and it lasted months, but we were drifting when I wrote the song, and it's to do with my feeling dissociated from, she was a far bigger star than I would ever be, and I felt a bit alienated by that. I mean, I think some of that Tony Perkins thing probably lurks in the back of it, you know. You know, that the verse about you're up there on the screen, you know, it was that sort of gulf between what I perceived as a very rightly successful career and where I was, which was just like a sort of jobbing musician and not, you know, in the same league. And I felt kind of alienated. So it has that is going on, and there are other things besides. So it's a bit stony, but you know, it's that really.
Yeah,
I like the song very much, and it's done well for me over the years.
Yeah. Well, from Everyone, which was not actually a solo album, Radio Lady is my pick.
Yeah, I wrote that when Liverpool Scene was. Oh no, not yeah, when Liverpool Scene was together. I wrote it. Oh, was it 19? No, actually, no, I did write it after Liverpool Scene split up. What happened was we reformed Liverpool Scene in 1970. So I've got to think about this because maybe I'm wrong about that. I was thinking that we did it on a Liverpool Scene split up, and then we did a tour of Norway, but not with the band because the band had split up. But we put together, but because we were contracted to do it, Adrian and I put together a band and called it Liverpool Scene. But David Richards played bass in that. That was the first time I worked with David. And John Pearson was the drummer, who was in Everyone later. So that must have been the summer of 1970. And I thought that we did Radio Lady on that tour. But now thinking about, no, we didn't. No, I'm thinking of a song called Ivy, which came out of this, in my mind, is associated with. Radio Lady was written on the trio tour in 71. There were Ian, Richard Thompson, and myself, and it was a night in New York. It was a woman that worked for Island Records that I got to know, and it was just about the New York experience, really, secondhand clothes, and the sort of craziness of you know, a brief but passionate affair. I think, you know, that's what it came from. Funnily enough, I considered doing it on the solo show a couple of weeks ago, and that was an early casualty. I was on the list for a time, and then when I just felt I couldn't justify it. I was trying to hang songs together. I had a segment in the show of there's a song called Richmond, which so it was places. It was songs about places. There was a song about Liverpool, obviously, but it was a song written by Willie Russell, Liverpool playwright, and I produced an album on him in about 20 years ago now. And I took a song he wrote about Liverpool called Glad Town, and then mashed it with an Adrian Henry poem called Mrs. Albion, You've Got a Lovely Daughter. So I had a friend reading that poem at the end of the song and that was a sort of mashup that worked really well. Richmond we did. Then I sang a song called Heaven is a Hill Called Hampstead, because that was the lead-off song from that musical that Bob Kirby had been in the pit band for in 1974. Because the whole show was set on a London number 24 London bus. Act 1 was from Southend Green Hampstead to Pimlico, and Act 2 was from Pimlico back to Southend Green Hampstead by night. And the set was a bus. We bought a bus, cut it in half, and that was it. That was the set. And it was just, the musical was all the people who kept getting on the bus, and they'd all got a story. And
was that the the red double-decker bus? Was that?
Yeah,
Okay.
a route master. It was one of those, yeah, with a platform at the back with a pole. And yeah, and the show was called Mind Your Head. It did very well.
Before you do, like you line up for the concert or show, the songs, how much editing and how much scratching out do you normally do?
Yeah, quite a lot, because I don't do solo shows very much. In fact, the last solo show I did, this one I did was the first one I'd done since before COVID. Last one I'd done before that was 2019. Now, I played lots of shows. I've toured with Ian. I've gone out working with bands. I work with a guy called Mike Berry in this country, and I play locally around here. I don't, I don't work as much as I'd like to, but I don't work all the time. But there are times when I get busy and do stuff. But actual pure solo shows, when I stand up and just do stuff from those records and things from my life that tie in, that's very rare. I've done 4 in the last 12 years, and the previous one was in 2019. So to do this one, which went off very successfully, I'm relieved to say, a couple of weeks ago, I put an intense, certainly a couple of months of considering, thinking, what would I do? Why? There's got to be a reason for doing it. It's got to have a narrative. So for it to be a satisfying evening, it has to start somewhere, and it has to have a narrative that moves through and is coherent, and then it has to finish somewhere. And I want the purpose, the reason for the songs to be a part of the show as much as the songs are, and so I choose them, and there's always a reason. This show, I mean, I'm afraid the reason for a lot of it was mortality. I mean, losing Zoot, we lost a bass player called Herbie Flowers, who lived locally here. Herbie died about 4 months ago. Lost so many people in my life have gone now, and I sang a song from the very first solo album called Where the Soul of Man Never Dies, which is I learned from the singing of a bluegrass duo called Sandy and Jeannie Darlington. And I actually did 3 songs from their repertoire on that first solo album. I was so struck with them, because I'd never really, bluegrass tonality was something I didn't know about. And they were quirky songs too. But The Soul of Man is just a traditional Baptist song, religious song. But I'd read that Jeannie McClary, she divorced Sandy, by the early 70s. They weren't a couple anymore. Her name was Jeannie McClary, and she just died at a ripe old age. But she kept working very much within the mountain folk area of music, and I wanted to acknowledge it. They meant a lot to me in the 60s, and so I did that song, and I did it with Will, my son, singing harmony. That flat shape note, open fourths and fifths harmony, that real old-timey harmony. So there were people that had gone all through the show. And a friend of mine in the guy that introduced me to Sally, my wife, died 20 years ago. He actually, the 20-year anniversary of his death was the day after I played that solo show. So that was something that I wanted to acknowledge in the show. So there was a lot of just mentioning, I wasn't dwelling on any of this stuff, but there was a more than a hint of mortality through the whole thing. But then there was this place narrative as well, the locations that were tying it together, and the children motif was there. So there was a lot going on, and that doesn't happen impromptu. You know, that's
No.
it's a constructed thing, and it's not written down except in here, but it's there is a narrative, you know,
Right.
and that's how I like to work. I like there to be a reason, and also it's very lyric heavy. I mean, I just think songs are about words. I
Yeah.
like a good tune,
Yeah.
but I was always very struck by that story of Oscar Hammerstein's widow, at a party after quite recently, after Hammerstein had died. She overheard somebody at a party talking about how much they loved Jerome Kern's Old Man River. And she went over to them and she said, "Excuse me, my husband wrote Old Man River. Jerome Kern wrote Dum 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 Dum."
Yeah.
It's a great story.
It is
It's a
good
great story, you know,
It
and
is.
that's kind of what I feel about songs. You know, the words, I think lyrics are there to be savored, and
Right.
they're up front. They have to be up front.
Yeah.
So I like that school of
Right.
record mixing. I haven't really carried it through, but I'm not a good enough singer to do it. But it's good if I sang as well as Iain Matthews. I do it all the time.
Yeah.
Of mixing the voice prominent,
Right.
and
Right.
and you know, and then the music will fill in the gaps between. But you know, if you listen to Sinatra, that voice is way up
Oh
there.
yeah.
You know, it's
Oh
in
yeah.
your face, and then
Yeah.
you've got all the you know the arranging brilliance of
Right.
Billy May and Nelson Riddle surrounding it. You know,
Right.
I just love that stuff.
Yeah.
But I'm a lyrics man, so
Yeah.
that's also a big part of it. But it all worked a treat. I'm pleased to say now, because I worry about it going into the show, but it went down and people got it and they enjoyed it and they liked it a lot. So that was good. You know.
Well, I wanted to one more album before Urban Cowboy. Now that predates the movie by like some 7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you try to sue for
Ooh.
use of your name?
Of course not. Of course not. It's just 2 words, you know.
I'm being
I mean, it is interesting that you do sort of wonder, but
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
I mentioned this to somebody the other day, and they said, "Oh no, there was something that predated that," and I had a look, and there was. I can't remember
Yeah.
what it was now, but there was something. I don't know
Was
whether it was a reference
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
literature or something. Anyway, you know,
Yeah.
it was
I was
just
being
an idea.
I was being facetious, but yeah,
No,
that
no, I get it. But it was
yeah.
interesting when the film came out. So
Right.
hang
Right.
on, you know, I
Right.
did
Right.
that years
Yeah.
ago, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
But
But
it was that thing that I've always been fascinated by, where the old West meets the new West. You know, I
yeah.
think that's a real interesting dynamic,
Right.
and so yeah, that's
Right.
part of it.
Well, the title track, uh, nice cross pollination of folk and country. I hear,
Yeah,
I hear, I hear the band, some band influence, and a little Graham Parsons in that.
all of that.
Yeah.
It came out of the Liverpool Scene year. I think 1972. I wrote the song,
Yeah.
and I was just awash with all those references by then. Yeah,
Yeah.
and very much because I was being influenced by Iain. Iain was a voracious consumer of music, and he'd go out, spend all of his money and more on records, and you know, he'd just impulse buy on the look of something, and
Yeah.
come back and he'd play it and
He's
decide it wasn't for him and give it to me, you know. So I mean, a lot of stuff. I mean, that's how I got Merle Haggard live at Muskogee, Oklahoma, which
yeah.
absolutely hit big with me. He
Yeah.
loathed it. It was far too hard country. He did never like country western particularly. I thought it was the most brilliant record, you know, and it influenced me heavily forever.
Yeah.
So stuff like that, yeah. But Urban Cowboy
Yeah.
was it was one of a bunch of songs I wrote about the same girl, again from that 1971 tour. So I was obviously lurching from town to town, getting involved with girls. But
Yeah.
there's a girl I met in Detroit at a club called the Poison Apple. I wrote a song called Poison Apple
Poison
Lady.
Apple Lady. Yeah. I was going to
Yeah,
mention that. Yeah.
there's another song
Yeah.
called the new Kerensky, because her name was Karen Goskowski. The
Uh-huh.
new Kerensky is about her. Uh, Urban Cowboys about her. I can't remember. There may well be others as well.
Well, I like that.
So,
The demo. There's a few demos on that collection. Poison Apple Lady, the demo, the stripped down version.
mm,
I almost prefer that to the album version. That demo.
yeah. I mean, yeah, there are some different versions of things around, but mostly I persuaded them to go with alternate versions because I owned the alternate, so I could charge them more money.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Right.
because if they were just going to go with the original recordings, they were going to be paying licenses, but they're going to be paying it to the people who own the original recordings, which isn't me.
Yeah.
So if there were recordings that I owned that
Mhm.
I felt could be justifiably there as part of the collection, then they'd be paying the money to me. So
Right.
it was a no-brainer, Greg. So
You were smart enough to figure that out. Yeah.
I
Right.
did figure that out. Listen, I told them what I was doing and why. I mean, because yeah, it needed to be understood. It was Colin Harper that did the liner notes for that
Yeah.
collection, and I think it was Colin Harper. Oh no, did Colin do the liner notes for that? Can't remember now, or forget. He might have done the Liverpool Scene collection instead. No, I think Colin did that one. I'm pretty sure he did that one.
He did that one.
Yeah,
Well,
I think so.
well,
And anyway, yeah, that's why those things are there.
yeah. Well, Home at Last. That's one of my favorites. Now, is that a Fender Rhodes that John Megginson's playing on that one? Do you
It's a
remember?
Fender Rhodes, I think, that Zoot Money is playing.
Oh,
I might be wrong. No, maybe Zoot's playing piano, and I can't remember. We had 3 keyboard players in that band.
Right, because that sound, it reminds me of Zeppelin's No Quarter. The Fender Rhodes in No Quarter. It reminds me of that eerie kind of eeriness. But it's
I
a
think I'm
nice.
pretty sure it's Zoot.
Yeah.
But we also Neil Innes is on there as well, and I think he might be on grand piano. Mego might be playing something like Wurlitzer or so. I think there's 3 keyboards on it, because but we were on tour at the time with Grimm's, and we were a track light, and that song, and I can't give you a background to the song. It just came out of. There's a definite Beauty and the Beast quality about it. Weeping Diamonds for the Beast, and that's an image from the film, the Cocteau film, La Belle et la Bête. And I think I'd recently seen that and been quite impressed. I think a lot of that sensibility, certainly the second verse of that song, I think was sort of derived from Beauty and the Beast, but the original John Cocteau film. Just image wise, but the band was on tour, and it was the easiest thing, rather than hitting the phone and hiring session players, was to say to Sandy, who's producing all of it, why don't we just take this back? We're on tour anyway, or I'll just throw a morning session into a day that we were probably playing, the London School of Economics or something like that. So we hired Olympic Studios for one session, threw the Grimm's band in there, recorded the whole thing in its entirety, and that was it, done. And then we got the track we needed. It was something like that. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Plainsong with Iain. At the time, there was just the one album, In Search of Amelia Earhart.
Yeah.
From '72 that was released. But I like some of the covers on there, showing that you and Ian's love for American folk, Jerry Yester, Judy Henske, one of their tracks, and one a really unheralded artist, Paul Siebel. I have a 2 for 2 of his albums on Elektra. He was one of the Elektra artists.
I think there were only 2. Yeah, I think there's Wood, Smoke and Oranges and Jackknife Gypsy. I think they're the 2.
Right. Nice cover of Louise.
There's not a whole lot more. I was introduced to him years later by again, an old friend of mine, long gone, called Ed Kelleher, who's American, very good friend of Liverpool Scenes, and I knew him from Liverpool, and he was in the American Army, and he did a couple of tours in Germany, and we met him playing with Liverpool bands, playing German army bases, and he got into the habit of when he had a weekend off, he'd come over and stay with us in Liverpool. He'd arrive in uniform with the kids throwing stones at him as he walked up the street, and he just had a sort of rucksack with a t-shirt and a pair of jeans, and that was it. So out of uniform into the t-shirt and jeans, and he spent the weekend, and he wrote poems, and he was just a remarkable guy. Later on, he wrote plays. He was a publicist for Bowie. He was a publicist for Melanie. He worked for Cashbox magazine. He ended up working for Film Digest. He wrote for Cream magazine. You remember Cream, that wonderful,
yes,
anarchic magazine. He
CRE with two E's.
Yeah, CREM. Yeah. Cream. In fact, because Ed wrote for them, I had a subscription. He fixed me up a subscription. I used to get it mailed over from the States for years. And he wrote a column every week called Drive-In Saturday Night, and under the name of Edouard Dauphin. That was his pen name. And I remember, and it was the craziest column. He reviewed the kind of films that he wrote. He wrote Invasion of the Blood Farmers and Greek of the Mutilated. Screenplay by Ed Kelleher. Don't eat before you see this movie, and you'll have nothing to lose. It was just, this guy was absolutely he was epic crazy man, and and he was absolutely dovetailed into Warhol and Lou Reed, and it just fantastic, great character. What am I talking about, Ed? What was the point of it?
Paul Siebel.
I remember now. Yeah. Paul Siebel. He introduced me to Paul Siebel in a shebeen in New York City, because there was always a time when like 1 a.m. or something, and the bars all shut. And if you were a serious drinker like Ed was, and Paul Siebel was, you'd go to a shebeen, which was just like somebody's house. I remember being taken into this room, bare wood floor, no furniture, and in the middle of the floor was a pile of cans of beer about 20 high, just a stack of boxes and crates of canned beer. And that was it. And you were just literally buying, and it was for people who just didn't want to stop drinking. And Ed, Andy, come over here. Someone I want you to meet. And it was Paul Siebel.
Okay.
At that point was, I think, a baker. He was working as a baker in somewhere like Queens or Brooklyn or something, And Ed introduced me to Paul, and and it was the end of a long night, so I don't think anything, sort of coherent was talked about. But I met Paul Siebel. But he was a hero of ours. We tried to get him to join Plainsong. When Bobby Ronga left, we were looking for we had a vacancy for a fourth member, and Iain flew to New York to try and talk Paul Siebel into joining Plainsong. That's how much we loved the man,
Wow.
Yeah,
that would have been something.
Yeah, it would have been, but he probably would have blown us out the water because he was so strong as a writer. But he was just bloody brilliant, and of course we'd done. What was the song?
Louise.
Yeah.
Louise. Yeah.
We done Louise on the first album, but we did Bride 45 on Ian's solo album, Journeys from Gospel Oak. We did that, but I mean, he was just massive for us. Such a great writer. Yeah.
We'll talk about on that album, the true story of Amelia Earhart's last flight.
Yeah.
What that's about for viewers that don't remember or not familiar with the song. The true story.
Yeah. Well, that whole Amelia Earhart obsession. See, again, that was so organic. Had a narrative to it. I had found this song. I keep saying it was by the Dillards, but I don't think it was by the Dillards. I can't remember who it was by, but I found a bluegrass version of the Red River Dave McHenry song, which is called sometimes it's called Farewell, First Lady of the Air, but other times it's just called Amelia Earhart's Last Flight. Red River Dave was a radio cowboy in the 30s. She disappeared in 1937, and he wrote the song contemporaneous with her disappearance, and it was a minor hit. He played it on his radio show and whatever, and it had been covered as a bluegrass tune by somebody, and the only version that I know that I do still have is by a Texan band called Laramie, who are so bad it's laughable, and and because of that became a favorite album of mine and Viv Stanshall's. In fact, my copy of their the Laramie album, there's only ever one, has got a sticker on the back that Viv put on there where it says, "The sheets are alive to the sound of cane shum." That's a Viv Stanshall sticker on the back of Laramie. Anyway, they do a version of Amelia Earhart's Last Flight on that. And that's the version that I took the lyric from and we recorded with Plainsong. But in the meantime, there was a man in here in London, again, he's gone now. His name is Bernard Stone, and he was a bookseller. And Bernard's bookshop, Turret Books, was a real meeting place for London literati of a certain stripe. All the poets used to converge on Bernard's original shop, which was in Kensington Church Walk, just off Kensington High Street, very fancy part of London. And any time, day or night, that you got there, Bernard would have a bottle of good red wine open, and and everyone was made welcome. And many a time I've sat there and played guitar in the shop and all this sort of thing. And there on the shelves, there was a little section of books about aviation. I later found out that this section was nothing to do with Bernard. All Bernard's books were first editions of fancy, Omar Khayyam and, beautiful poetry and all this stuff. This section of books on aviation was owned and being sold on behalf of his assistant Eleanor's boyfriend, who happened to be into aviation for whatever reason. He might have been a pilot for all I know. But one of the books was this book called The Search for Amelia Earhart, by a man called Fred Gerner, who was a San Francisco journalist. And none of which I knew. I thought, great title. Whoa, have a look through. Oh, pictures of this lost lady fly. I sort of vaguely knew the story, but didn't really know that much about it. Did know the song, but I hadn't pulled it all together. Read the book and was blown away by the hypothesis, which was that she had been spying for the American government when she went down, and that what had been sold to the public as a tragic accident by a brave lady who was pushing the boundaries of flight was in fact much more sinister than that, and that it was Fred Gerner's thesis was that she'd been flying a plane that had been massively modified and was basically taking photographs whilst flying around the world, and which was her publicly declared endeavor. She was taking photographs of military significance of Japanese outposts in the Pacific to aid the Americans, who knew that war with Japan was definitely coming. But this was 4 years before Pearl Harbor.
Right. 37.
Yeah. So I read this book. I was blown away by it. gave it to Ian. He read it. He was blown away by it. All the band read it. We thought it was amazing. Then we pulled in the original song and started doing that. And on the back of all of that, Ian synthesized that song, that book in song, with his song, The True Story of Amelia Earhart. And then when we recorded the album, I mean, we'd already recorded it really, but those two songs were on it. And we were thinking about, well, you know, what's going to be the sleeve, how are we going to sequence the tracks and all that sort of thing. And the whole Earhart thing just leapt out at us and said, you know, this is, you know, and people subsequently, it was so much stamped with the Earhart image and in the cover with the Lockheed Electra flying across the Japanese sun and all that, that people thought it was a concept album, but it wasn't. It had got those two songs and Albert E. Brumley's I'll Fly Away, and they're the only things that could remotely be stretched to be about Amelia. But we've done a lot of things about Amelia since, in the more recently recorded records.
Yeah. Well, there were a couple of other tracks on there I wanted to mention. They're my favorites off of that album. Even The Guiding Light and Side Roads. Side Roads.
Yeah, Side Roads is and I put for the second time up there as well. Even The Guiding Light they're all Ian songs, and because he was still flying high. I mean, Ian's a prolific writer, which I've never been. I'm always very slow and quite picky about how I do things, and I edit and revise all the time. Ian just chucks it out there, and then, you know, he comes up with remarkable stuff. Even The Guiding Light is about him leaving Fairport Convention, you know, so it references Meet on the Ledge and that kind of thing. Side Roads is just another of the songs. I don't know what it's exactly what its genesis was, but he just was writing really good stuff. You know, it's a good song.
Yeah. Well, real briefly, because we're running a little long here, but during the
surprise,
surprise.
Yeah, old Motormouth Roberts has done it again. You know,
I have another
chuck him
one.
A dime and just stand back.
Right. I have another one coming up in a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
no,
during the talk about playing with Vivian and Grimm's.
Well, I met Vivian in 1965 at the Edinburgh Festival when he was working with Lindsay Kemp, and he was a mime artist, and and we hit it off immediately. And he told me about his band, the Bonzo Dog Band, and I said, "Well, what is it that you do?" And he said rather ponderously, "We find bad music and play it badly."
Yes.
So I thought, oh, I got to see this. So he told me, I've still got the notebook. Actually, I have an archive that's with the John Moores University in Liverpool. All my personal papers are there now. And I've got the notebook where I wrote it down, or actually he wrote it down. It's in his handwriting. It says Bonzo Dog Band, Bonzo Dog Doodah Band.
Yeah, Doodah.
And then I think it says Ealing Park Tavern, Tuesdays, I think it says, which was the nearest to where I lived in London. So that's where I first went to see them. Latterly, I went to see them all over South London, which was much more their thing, really, sort of Catford and Greenwich around there. And in those days, they were a sort of vaudeville band. You know, they were an old sort of, you know, old school swing band, you know. And they found records like, you know, I'm going to bring a watermelon to my girl tonight, you know. all those wonderful lyrics, and, you know, Mickey's Son and Daughter, and all those crazy old tunes. And then they play them with wild enthusiasm, but nobody could really play apart from Rod Slater. And they pepper it with it. And Neil, of course, it was absolutely a rock on piano in the middle of it. But they pepper it with explosions of whoopee whistles, and so it was like Spike Jones. You know, it had all that going for it. It was the most remarkable thing. Um, and that was it, really. I mean, they were building a following at the same time we were building a following. They had a very, I mean, if you see lists from 67, 68, there are lists around of what you would have to pay to get bands to play for your college. You know, they were circulated round, so you know you could construct what you could afford for your Saturday night show and all the rest of it. And the Bonzo Dog Band, well, they dropped the doodah. The Bonzo Dog Band were like £500 in 1967, 68. But that's a huge amount of money. I mean, Liverpool Scene was really, I mean, we might have reached £100. I think we were up to 250 by the time we split up, but probably even by the time we were touring with Led Zeppelin, we weren't getting more than 100, maybe 150 for a gig. £500. I mean, it was really big bucks. They were very, very successful. I just always stayed in touch with Viv. And then when Liverpool Scene split and I moved back down to London, that was my sanity. I mean, imagine equating Viv Stanshall with sanity, but I was living with my mum and dad. I mean, I felt very down. I mean, you know, the travails of the Everyone crash were yet to come, you know, but that was all I could do. If I left Liverpool and was going to make anything of being in London, I had to, you know, stay with my mum and dad. And I couldn't stand it. I wasn't going to sit in the evenings at the age of whatever I was, 23, with my mum and dad watching, you know, rubbish on television. So fortunately, I was a driver. I had a car. So I would drive over to Viv's house because he only lived 20 minutes away. And we would get crazy together, you know. And so a very, very strong friendship built up then very quickly. And by the same token, the Bonzo that had broken up at around the same time, and Viv and Neil only were working as a duo. So they needed other people to bring into concepts that they had. So I was drawn into that. And they were very friendly with the Scaffold. And that was how the Grims thing came out. The Grims was an amalgamation of Scaffold, the two remnant members of Bonzo Dog, and me. So it's an acronym made up of the surnames of the people involved. Gorman is John Gorman and Scaffold. Roberts is me. Innes is Neil Innes. McGough is Roger McGough, the poet. McGear, as was, is Mike McCartney. I mean, it still would have been an M. And then S for Stanshall. It spelt Grims. So we thought, you know, what are we going to call ourselves? Oh, hang on, look. If we put all the names together, it says Grims. Let's be Grims. You know, it kind of made sense. Everybody knew the fairy tales, and it seemed like a nice concept. Yeah. So that's how the thing grew. So I just, like, Viv became arguably my bestest friend in London. I just adored him and spent a lot of time. But he was volatile. You know, his mental state was volatile. And the Grims thing, he left before the end. He was the first dropout, really. By mid-74, I think Viv had left. And then Mike McCartney left fairly soon after. He'd had an altercation with one of the poets. I mean, how do you do that? So, yeah, there were sort of tensions around, and the thing was evolving and moving in different directions. Everything. It became a pure theatre act by the end. Yeah. In 76, we what was left was myself, Roger McGough, and John Gorman, and we did a show in 76 for that year. We did with two girls, one of whom became immensely famous later on, but wasn't at the time, called Victoria Wood, and a girl called Lindsay Ingram, who I knew I'd worked with her in television, doing a TV musical, and she was the current girlfriend of a guy who remains one of my great friends and colleagues called Hank Wangford, and
Hank Langford.
they were, they were. But that's all for later on and another occasion, probably.
Maybe so. Part two. Part two.
Well, we've only got to 1975. I mean,
Right.
we haven't even talked about Roy Harper, and I started working with Roy.
I had
76,
that chips and black sheep. Chips and black sheep. Yeah. Yellow Dog with Kenny Young. Yeah.
Kenny Young. Yeah.
Yeah.
Listen, I mean, all I ever did was stand still, and all this stuff arrived. I mean, I never planned any of it, none of it at all. It was just, the phone would ring and someone would be there,
Right.
Including Dave Gilmour saying, what are you doing? Would you be available to play with Pink Floyd? Yeah. I mean, I had to think about that one.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
For about 2 nanoseconds.
It took you that long.
But honestly, I mean, you don't plan for this stuff. It happens. Life is what happens when you're making other plans, as John Lennon once said.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the more experience you got, the more in demand you are, and more people will call on you.
I never felt like I was in demand. I just never did, and I still don't. I don't feel like I'm in demand. I feel like I'm extremely fortunate that every now and then I get to do stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that said, I ended up scoring films for Disney. I mean, I spent my time in Mauschwitz.
Yeah.
Not that they liked us calling it Mauschwitz. That was when I was doing. I was working with a bunch of Brits, and in the cutting room, we used to refer to the Buena Vista lot as Mauschwitz. And it got to the 4th floor. The Team Disney building. They heard that the Brits were dissing the lot, and we got this memo saying, "Would the Brits mind ceasing to refer to the Buena Vista lot as Mauschwitz?" So we said fine, and we thought about it for about a day, and thereafter we called it Dachau.
Duck. Perfect. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah,
that's good.
It was all in good fun. It's nobody was trying to, make any points. It was just a thing. But
I know.
But honestly, I mean, how could you be? You can't plan on this stuff. I mean, I had a 15-year career as a screenwriter that came after all the records and the music and the sessions. And I went, and then I got into theatre, and I was music director at the Royal Court Theatre in London for 4 years, doing theatre music, and then through that I got into, actually through the musicals earlier on, I'd got into TV writing, and then that carried on and became very intense. By 1985, that was pretty much all I was doing until Iain came along and we reformed Plainsong. I was doing very little performance. I was just scoring because I was working all the time. Did some theatre, did some big theatre shows in the late 80s. But it was just all TV stuff. And then through TV, I got into movies, and then, got this job with Disney and all of that, but it was all through standing still, and it just landed in my lap. You can't plan it. I mean, I thought, well, you probably could if you were a different sort of person, but I'm not a planner.
No,
I'm really not. I just drift.
Yeah.
If it seems worth doing, I'll do it. The good thing is I've never done crap for money. I've never had to do. I mean, I know people who've done, spent a lifetime writing commercials and stuff. I've only ever did 2 commercials in my life, and I loathe both of them. So I just stopped doing it, but I've never actually had to do bad work just to put bread on the table. I've always managed to kind of get by, and I've never made a fortune, but I own a house, and I brought up 3 kids, and, we've got a life, and it's okay. It's all good,
All good. It's all good.
Yeah.
It is, Andy, and it's all been good today too. So
I've only got 1 cat in the yard, but it is our house.
CSNY.
Yeah.
Oh, well, that's good. I just have the one dog myself, so
Yeah,
that's plenty, plenty. All right, Andy.
yeah,
Well,
great.
again, thank you so much for your time and for
No
sharing and
problem.
your own anecdotes. That's what
Yeah.
I think the viewers really enjoys those. And we will keep in touch, stay in touch, and I'll send you over a copy of this once I do get it edited, a week or so, something like that.
Okay.
And then you can
Yeah.
post it on your socials or your website.
Yeah, that'd be good. That'd be good.
Do that. All righty.
Yeah.
Well, you have a good
Yeah.
rest of the weekend, okay?
Okay. Well, I might be dressed next time you see me. I mean, I was literally, I was taking a shower. I was sitting in a nightshirt.
You have to be comfortable. That's the main thing. So.
Well, I have been comfortable, I must say.
All right. Well, it's
But
been
that's about it.
very enjoyable. Very enjoyable.
No problem, Greg.
All right. Thank you again. All right.
Message me when you want anything.
All right. I will. Thank you, and all the best.
Man.
All the best.
Cheers, man. Bye.